So we're going to start discussing Project 4 and Photoshop in creating your designs. So a couple of things before we get started. I want to make sure that you've watched the PowerPoint for the color lecture, Volume 2. You've also have read over the assignment sheet and looked at the project examples for the identity tessellation mask. If you haven't, stop, go back, do this, then come back. So to get started, one of the things we're going to do is we're going to use the rhombus cutter here. Again, at this point as well, you should have gone through the Photoshop demonstrations posted on the OneDrive for all the selection tools. So if you haven't done that, you need to go stop and do that now. But once you've done all those, then you can come in to the identity tessellation module and we're going to click on Rhombus Cutter. This is a template that you will need to organize your design for Project 4. So I'm going to click on this and we'll go straight into Photoshop. All right, there it is. I'm going to minimize that window, come back. So I have my 01 document that I was using for selection. It has my alpha channels. So I'm going to leave that because I'm going to start using that as a source for using my rhombus cutter here. Now, this is one of the reasons why I like having separate windows for my files that I have open in Photoshop. If it was an application frame, they'd be tabbed, or it'd be something like this. And I want to be able to see both of them at the same time, because what I'm going to do ultimately is I'm going to move images and sources from, well, maybe not. Let's try this again. I'm going to move imagery like my cherry tomato here over here. And this is essentially going to simulate what you will be doing for your design. But before we start moving anything over, I'm going to just minimize this because this is going to get in the way. All right, so there we go. We'll just look at this for a moment. I want to break this down and show you what you're looking at. So to do that, I want you to get into the Layer tab, and you're going to see that there's a background layer, and I have it locked. Leave that locked. It's going to be like the white of the page, right? This is essentially like a blank canvas. So when you are creating the collage, like you did for the project 3, you had the board, the Bristol board. Here you have this file. And so you'll use this to start to organize your design. And so you have different ways to think about your design. So here's a rhombus shape where this is what it's going to look like when it's done. Now you may organize your design within this shape. However, if you want something symmetrical, I have other triangle shapes here for you to utilize in creating a more symmetrical design. And so this is what you should be doing first. You should bring in your sources, dragging them over here, and then start playing around with these different triangle shapes that will ultimately create your design. Now, I have some designs finished here that I'm opening. I'm going to open up, and these are the ones that you saw in the um, examples. And so I'm just going to show you how this works so that you get an idea. Once you see it visually, then you can think, okay, this is what I need to do. So you have 4 sources you need to utilize. Now you can repeat those as many times as you want. I'm going to teach you different ways to manipulate an individual image in here, whether that's for creating a halftone or if creating a flat shape. Here's the halftone of the dot pattern that you see. And so there's different ways we're going to be able to, I'm going to show you how to manipulate it. And all these different ways will assist you in manipulating the color ultimately, right? Because you're supposed to be making color systems with these designs, and so you're going to need to be able to manipulate them individually. So what I'm going to show you is that you can have a design that is either uh, symmetrical, and I'm going to use this equilateral triangle to compose the composition, and then I will mirror it. Now, you can see that this part down here is just wasted, right? I'm not paying any attention to it because I'm cropping it off. Now remember, the eyeball to the left of the thumbnail makes it visible. So when I turn that off, it's showing me like, well, this stuff isn't, I'm not going to see this in the final design. I'm only going to see what's cropped off. Um, Now, let's say you want to create a design within this full rhombus shape, and maybe you don't want it to be symmetrical, like sort of have an axis. Then I have a design that does that, right? And so you can see here's all the imagery that's cut off here, um, and I just composed it in this whole shape. And that's perfectly acceptable too, a way to approach your design. Doesn't have to be symmetrical, can be asymmetrical. It's up to you. Um, if I turn off the rhombus shape here, you can sort of see what's going on behind that black frame. Okay, um, and so this just helps to separate all that sort of busyness that's happening on the outside edge, which you would probably cut off if you were using it glue and scissors or X-Acto knife. So this is just going to sort of streamline the composition into the shapes. Now, if I'm using, click these back on and get back to this one. Now I could use an equilateral triangle for this. I could also go down to a right triangle. And so I could organize this may be all you need to compose in, right? It's this little tiny triangle, and then essentially the rhombus shape will be composed of 4 of these, okay? So this is one solution. Another solution would be this isosceles triangle. So if I do the isosceles triangle, and maybe I should do here, I could do the isosceles triangle, and this could be the the triangle I use to mirror it, and I'll mirror it along a vertical axis, is up to you. Um, so this is where I would say experiment, play with different compositions. You can save different versions, and I'm going to show you how to do that, okay? So here we're seeing the end game. This is what you're looking for to do when I say have the digital design done. I don't mean the full rhombus. I'm talking about this triangular shape. Unless, of course, you are going to do an asymmetrical one, then you're going to work on a little bit larger. If you choose the equilateral one, it's going to be something like this. Okay, and so this is what you should be doing, sort of determining which shape you're going to use and move forward. Now, once we get here and you've manipulated the images and you start playing with the design and then you finalize the design, then I will show you how to mirror it. I'll show you how to manipulate the colors and changing things. And so all of those things will come later. Let's go back to the blank rhombus cutter. So here we are, and we're going to start with just pulling in some of the squash and cherry tomato as a source. I don't expect you to have your sources ready to go and selected at this point, but you can do this with me just to get some feel for how you will manipulate your subjects within the design. And then also give you a little navigation of, well, how are you going to get something from A to B? So here, I'm going to use, let's say, cherry tomato first. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to select, deselect, because I want to remind you how to make a selection that you've already saved as an alpha channel. If you've closed this file down and come back to it, I want to make sure you understand how to access it. So I'm going to go to my channel, and I'm going to hold the cursor over the thumbnail, hold the command key on a Mac, hold the control key if you are on a PC, and click. And again, over the thumbnail. Just get used to doing that when you're loading a selection. So now that it's selected, I'm going to just verify to make sure RGB and all the layers, or all the channels rather, are selected. They are, so I'm going to go back to layers. And then before I move anything, I'm going to come back to the rhombus cutter, and I just want to talk a little bit about the layers and the layers order of them, because this is going to be important as you start building your composition here. So you have the background layer, it's locked, can't do anything there. But above it, you have 4 layers for these cutting shapes, right? These shapes you're going to use to frame your design. Now, what we want to do is we want to put the design subjects between the background and these cutting shapes, all right? And so I'm just going to turn these off, and so you can see that it's just white shape. And when you look at your layers palette, it's like a stack of paper, right? The equilateral paper is on top, right? And then right underneath it is the right triangle, the isosceles and the rhombus shape, and then underneath it is the background at the very bottom of the stack of paper. And I can change the order of this by just clicking and dragging. Okay, so I can click and drag these and change the order any way that I want. And so we can manipulate where your subjects will reside within that space, like overlapping, by just clicking and dragging this down. So once we decide which shape, and if you're not sure which shape, you can leave it blank like this for now. But I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to use the equilateral triangle one so we can see this. And then, but before I go back to my selection document, I'm going to select and highlight the background. And the reason why I want to do that is because as I drag objects over here, or as I start to bring some layer from one file to another, it's going to place it in your layer palette right above the one that's highlighted. And so I'm going to preemptively set this up so that the object goes where I want it to, which is again between the background and any of these shapes that you're using. Okay, so what I'm going to do is Move tool. I'm going to click and highlight my selection document 01, and I'm going to move into the selected area. Remember, the cursor will tell you where you're at. I have the scissors. I'm going to click and drag it over, and I'm just going to bring it over right to the middle of the triangle, and then I'm going to release the mouse button. Takes a moment. There it is. So I just dragged this over. Now let's see what happened over in the layers palette. When you come back over here now, we can see that the background was highlighted, but when I dragged cherry tomato over, it created a new layer, the layer 1. It'll just, so you can keep numbering them the more layers you bring in, and it'll just bring it in and deposit it in this order of layers above whichever layer was selected. If I do this again, let's say I do it here, all right, that I'm going to pull it right on top of the right triangle. I'm going to come back over here, just click and drag, I'll deposit right here so it's on top. And now at this point, if I turn on the equilateral triangle, you can see it cuts off the stem, right? Because it's on top of that shape. So if I get rid of the right triangle, it's getting cropped off here. There it is there, because this layer 2 is above the right triangle one. Now the Move tool with layer 2 highlighted, I can drag this around. All right, so I can place this, and then I can also take layer 2 and say, oh, no, I want to bring it back down below all of those, and now it's behind everything again. Okay, and you can see even the interaction here between the 2 layers. Zoom in a little bit, and you can see how layer 2 is on top of layer 1, and I could easily change that order just by clicking and dragging the layer order. And so this is how we start to import imagery into certain designs, and we'll start to manipulate it once we have our source materials here. Once you bring all your source materials over, again, remember when you import your files, um, think about the resolution. It should be priority. You want it to be a resolution of 360. Um, Refer back to the image size video where you go into image, image size, and you can see, in fact, the resolution is 360, and this is dimensions for this file. And so that's where you want to make sure that you are um, paying attention to your sources as you import them. Things downloaded from the internet are not going to have very good resolution. I would strongly recommend that you, taking photographs or scanning things in. That way you have control over that resolution. And again, these rhombus shapes are quite small. If I go to view and turn on my rulers, you can see that the height of this, half of this rhombus, is less than 5 inches, and the width here is, maybe 2 inches. So the rhombus shape in general, in its entirety here, is not very large, right? This square is 7.5 by 10. And so you can see that this is a little bit over 5.5 inches wide, and I want to say it's a little bit over 10 inches tall. Okay, so your source dimensions don't have to be very large, but the resolution needs to be 360. And again, if you're using the equilateral triangle or even going smaller with the right triangle, dimensions are going to be really miniature, all right? Because if you have a file, a photograph, and there's several elements to it that you want to include, you're going to probably need to scale it down just to crop it down and get a minimal part of it accessible by your viewer. So just keep that in mind as we drag these things in. So now we've gone over layer order and moving things over. So let's talk about, okay, so we've discussed moving layers over, and now we're ready to maybe start thinking about, well, how do we manipulate these sources once they're in the design? And so when we're here, we're going to want to be able to manipulate things, whether it's scale or repetition. Um, we'll get into manipulating color and even textures potentially. But let's first talk about scale rotation. Like we can move this, right? We move tool, we've already done that, right? We moved it from one file to the other. I can move these things around like this, but how are we going to, let's say, change these things even more so? And so what we're going to do is we're going to use what is called a free transform. And so with layer 1 selected, and I'm going to zoom into this. I'm going to go ahead and minimize that. And I'm going to go back to the equilateral triangle because it is a little bit larger to work with space-wise. So layer 1, so that's this one, okay? And I could click anywhere and move this, all right? And it all depends on what is highlighted. If layer 2 is highlighted, I can click over here. I don't have to actually click on that cherry tomato. I could click anywhere. And if I scroll down, I turn the background layer off, what was white becomes checkerboard. And what's happening here is that the checkerboard there's no content there. There's no pixels. It's empty. It's clear. All right. So that means transparency. So if I were to print this, well, the paper would probably be white. So this checkerboard isn't going to print. It would be white because there's no content there, no pixels. Um, but and so I could leave it checkerboard when I do my design, but that's really not how I would see it if I were to print it. So I'm going to leave white background on as I do this. But I could click anywhere on here, and that just helps to illustrate the layer, the content that's on the layer. It is only the cherry tomatoes. I can click here, but it drags it around just the same as if I were to click on it. If you were to imagine that the cherry tomato was painted on a clear piece of plastic and then laid on here, and I could grab it and move it anywhere. Okay, I'm getting some glitches. All right, so let's manipulate layer one. So layer one's going to be highlighted, and I'm going to move over to Edit, scroll down to Free Transform, and here I can move it again, but I got to have this bounding box around it. And what this bounding box is going to allow me to do, it's going to allow me to do um, distort, manipulate, enlarge, shrink this file, rotate it. I can spin it like this. I can take the corner and expand it. Now, what's new in Photoshop is that it will, from the corner, expand it proportionally to itself. Um, and so that's nice, right? I can make it proportionate to itself. But let's say you don't want to make it proportionate to yourself. Let's say you want to change its proportion. Let's say you want to make it skinnier. So what you can do is go over to the corner, hold the Shift key down, and you could stretch it, all right? Flatten it out a little bit. So you could distort it as you manipulate it. I can rotate this. If I can go back and sort of give it back to the space. I grab these anchor points, and I could do that this way as well on the sides, holding the Shift key. If I grab it, and without the Shift key, again, it's proportionate. The other thing I can do is I can grab this from the side here, and if I grab that and hold the Shift key, I can mirror it. All right, so I can really change the file. Now, you may not want to distort it too much. I mean, again, you are probably choosing sources that have some sort of connotation to help build and construct your identity. So if you distort it too much, we might not be able to decipher what you're trying to communicate to us. So just keep that in mind, is how much of your subject matter do you need to include so that we recognize it? And think of Picasso and the bull, right? It's abstracted, but there's enough information there for us to understand that it's derived from a bowl. So when you make your selections of subject matter here, it's important for you to understand how much should I reveal, how much should I conceal, and in doing so, is it still communicating what I need it to? And so these are things you need to be thinking about as you start composing your composition. So let's say I'm gonna leave it like this, and I'm going to go ahead and hit up at the option for this. I'm going to hit the checkbox that renders it. And so now that is part of that layer. I can move it around again, but I've rendered it. It's larger. It's passing in front of this one. And let's say I want to go ahead and just leave that one here. I want to move layer two. Just a little bit of overlap. Okay, so once this is here now, well, let's say I want to do another one. Well, I could go back to the source, but I already have two layers here. I could easily just take layer two, say I want another one that size, or to begin that size. I can take layer two, I can click, drag it to this piece of dog-eared paper down here, and it's made a copy. So now I can look at my layers here. I have layer two, now I have layer 2 copy. If I come over with layer 2 copy selected, I can click and drag that over, and there it is. All right, and if I want this in the background, very bottom, maybe I'll shift it there. So now I have this one here, and now with that one, I want to free transform it. Maybe I want to flip it, make it a little bit smaller, maybe get some perspective, depth illustration here through scale and proportion. So when I'm taking this, I could go to Edit and Free Transform, but I want to show you a couple options for the selection tool. So we didn't get into what these boxes meant when we first used the selection tool. I'm going to show you now. So show transform tools. If I have this clicked on, every time I highlight a layer, any content on that layer, I'm going to get that bounding box of the free transform tool. It's just like, if I turn that off, it's the same thing as if I were to go up to edit and choose free transform with that layer selected. There's my bounding box. So you can have that automated. I'm going to X out of that by having it on. So every time I change, the bounding box is there. My preference is I do not like this on because it's easy to accidentally move something by clicking it. And so if I have it on, sometimes things get nudged or some things will get changed proportionally or stretched that I did not intend to do. And so I just leave that off. Um, and it's a convenience if I need it, but I very rarely use that. Now, the other option for the move tool, and let's get back to this one, that the auto select. So I usually work with this off as well, unless I'm working, unless I really need to use it, right? This is something that if I have a file that is full of layers, in fact, I might come back to this one. Let me zoom in and I'll sort of show you how this works, all right? Not too much. If we look at my layers for this image, you can see there's several layers that are visible, right? One's layer 6. That doesn't mean that that's all that there is. It's on the top, but there's several layers underneath it. So I have all these different layers. But if I have auto select on, I can select this instead of trying to figuring out which one this yellow layer is here. I can just come over here and click, and it automatically changes this. If I wanted to see what this blue layer is over here, I just come over here with the cursor, auto select is on, click on that blue layer, and it will automatically highlight that. So if you have a design that has several layers on it, this becomes very helpful in identifying a layer. It's like, okay, where's this one at? I know it's behind this one. And sometimes the thumbnails get really small content-wise. So it's helpful to say, okay, I need to manipulate this layer here, auto select, come in and select it. When you have 3 layers, it's really not that hard, right? But even so, when I look at this, these are just little dots on these thumbnails, and it's not easy to determine, well, which one is this one, especially these two where they are not overlapped. Like I can tell this one's in front of this one, so this one's going to be on top. That's this one, right? But these two are so similar and so close that it is easier to have auto select on, click here, it automatically highlights this one, and then I can come in and manipulate this as I wanted to. So there, once it's done, approve it. And there's the other thing, I approved it, but I didn't know if it was rendered or not because the free transform controls are always on. So this is how you start going in and controlling and manipulating your sources for the composition. And again, depends on what shape you're using. Um, you should have it framed out as you're composing your design. That doesn't mean once you start on like the right triangle here, you don't have to commit to it. You can decide, oh, I don't like the direction this is going. Maybe I do want to use the isosceles triangle, which is fine. It's just a matter of a couple of clicks. It does open up a lot more areas that you need to utilize, but it's easy just to come in and select these and rearrange them as needed. All right, so go ahead and get started with this, and next time we'll start talking about how do you manipulate the images themselves beyond scaling and rotation.